Hello. Welcome to my channel Touching Stories. You're about to hear an amazing story about love and unexpected decisions. Enjoy watching. Andy Brown stood in the middle of the prison yard, chatting one last time with his buddies, his fellow inmates with whom in the same colony he had served a long, hateful sentence. The guy was given 5.5 years for a hit. And run. The case turned out to be high profile and was widely covered in the local press. After serving 5 years of his sentence, Andy decided to apply for parole. Fortunately, the warden was a good man and did know he could do good to people. When a positive answer came from the highest authorities regarding the early release of prisoner Brown, Andy, in the first moments, could not even believe that this joyous news was about him. Over the 5 years of his life in prison, the boy's character had hardened. He had little light in his soul, despite the fact that he, by nature, had always been a kind and sympathetic man. But, as they say, the colony is no resort, and he'd seen all sorts of things. So Andy preferred to build up a shell of apparent indifference to most things that were hard to take. For a young man, that was a much better option than getting involved in all sorts of showdowns between the local prison authorities. Brown tried not to draw undue attention to himself and, if possible, to serve his time quietly and with dignity, which he succeeded in doing. Well, Hitman, shall we say goodbye? A stout man in his 40s, with a fully tattooed back and shoulders, gave Andy a broad, calloused palm in a friendly way. It was summer, so the prisoners were allowed to change their heavy robes jackets for lightweight, heavy cotton shirts. The muscular prisoner allowed himself to take off his shirt and tie it around his waist, leaving only a white tank top, so everyone around him could see the huge Gothic letters in Latin embossed on his back, juxtaposed peacefully with the dome of an Orthodox church. "Yeah, I hope we don't see each other again," Andy said, shaking his outstretched hand. The men smiled at each other. "Here, take some cigarettes and some groceries for the men. Don't let them speak ill of you." Brown pulled several loaves of bread, a couple of loaves of sausage, and a small bundle of bagels from a pre-prepared bag already checked by the guards. "Wow, what a wealth," sincerely admired the boy. "Is this all from that mysterious package you got the other day?" The lad only nodded silently. The other prisoner grinned strangely. "You have a man waiting on the outside, I tell you. Remember Hitman? Did you ever carry a letter to a girl, but you forgot it?" Hitman was Andy's nickname in the penitentiary, more ironically than seriously. Everyone understood that such an exceptionally non-aggressive man as Brown could not deliberately, and even with some special cruelty, run over an ordinary man in the street. However, there was something sullen and a little cold in the silent guy's appearance, which, combined with his deep black eyes and prisoner's haircut, made him look like a character of a famous computer game. A professional and impenetrable killer, nicknamed Hitman. Andy's nickname played only to his advantage. Those of the newcomers who did not know his history were subconsciously afraid of a convict with such a dangerous nickname. Jack, with whom Hitman had a pretty good friendly relationship, only laughed at all this, but actively supported the scary legend to protect Andy from aggressive recidivists. "I don't know, Jack." "Well, whatever." Andy shook his head in a negative way. "Whatever you say, it's up to you," the acquaintance shrugged. "Just don't come back. You don't need it." "Got it?" Hitman just shrugged it off. What are we like old men saying goodbye? "But thank you, brother. Thank you for everything." The men hugged each other amicably, and at that moment, before the guards saw, Jack slipped a bundle into Andy's pocket. "Here, take this. It's from me and my brothers for the road. To get out of this hell quicker." Andy glanced stealthily at the bundle as well. It was several large bills folded in a tube and tied with a string of twine. "Thank you," the guy said masculine, and patted Jack on the strong back. "If you'll light a candle for us in church, we'll call it even," he said. Brown nodded again. He knew that Jack Bernard Patrick, took religious matters very seriously. In the past, he had even graduated from a religious school, but for a number of reasons he had tied his life to crime. For a number of reasons he had tied his life to crime, for which he was now paying the price. A little later, after saying goodbye to several other inmates, Andy, under the supervision of the guards, went up to the warden's office to pick up his papers and his release certificate. Sean Johnson was already waiting for him, and seeing him at the door, immediately waved, "Sit down quickly. I don't have time to meddle with you." He himself, meanwhile, was filling out the rest of the paperwork for Andy's release. Finally, after putting the heavy stamp on the certificate and putting his signature at the bottom, the warden looked at the boy. "You paged?" just asked Andy. He knew that their chief preferred to get straight to the point in conversations. "Cold," he said slowly. "Brown, then." "Well, look, Prisoner Brown, God forbid you get caught again, you'll never get parole again, and they'll give you so much time you won't even think about it." "I won't get caught, Comrade Warden," Brown answered calmly. "Now, life only according to the law, without any adventures. I'm warning you. I vouch for you personally. You were the best worker in the shop, exceeded your monthly quota every time. Don't let me down, old man." "That's right, Comrade Warden," Andy reported in a military manner and smiled cautiously. "I won't let you down. You've done a lot for me, and I'll be grateful to you for that for the rest of my life." The warden, frowning, looked at the boy from under his thick, graying eyebrows. "Come on, that's enough." "He's grateful. Tell me something. Can you get a job outside? You know, they don't take kindly to ex-prisoners there." Andy smiled slowly with one side of his face, as if he knew something that could decisively change his whole fate. "Why are you smiling like that? You'd think you had a treasure buried on the loose, like that man in the movie." Sean Johnson nervously snapped his fingers, trying to remember the name of the picture. Finally, he succeeded. "Escape from Shawshank Wall." The guy realized that he could scare his boss, so he looked down embarrassed, trying to suppress the laughter coming to his throat. Sean Johnson looked very funny himself, talking about Hollywood movies. No, that's not what I meant." Andy hastened to explain. "There's a debtor waiting for me on the outside, and if I can get what's owed me for all these years, then I won't need a job at all. I'll be a sweetheart for the rest of my life. I won't deny myself anything." The guy with obvious suspicion, "Are you planning revenge, Brown?" He squinted. "Maybe I oughtn't to let you out of here then. I don't know what's on your mind." And he raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "I promise, Sean Johnson, everything is only and exclusively within the law." The warden just smiled sadly and shook his chin slightly, as if he had heard such a phrase from the prisoners hundreds of times before. Under the law, then, well. A quarter of an hour later, Andy Brown finally left the grim walls of the colony, as soon as the tall steel gates, framed by barbed wire along the upper edge, slammed shut behind him. The boy suddenly realized that it was really real. That was it, the end. He could turn that last page and close the longest book of his life. He is free. Sensing the moment, Brown breathed in the free summer air. It was hot outside, 26 degrees or more. Andy took off his fall jacket and deftly folded it and stuffed it into a gym bag slung over his wiry shoulder. The boy glanced around the front gate. It was empty, a little discouraged that none of the friends he'd known before he boarded had come to meet him. The young man slowly strode toward the bus stop. The sun was beating down on him, and he was glad to see he had so little hair on his head that he had just had to shave his head again, leaving only a couple of centimeters for aesthetics. Feeling the sun's rays warming his pale skin, the boy involuntarily plunged into his own memories, and so deeply that he almost didn't pass the bus stop. Placing his bag of belongings on the old wooden seat, Andy waited patiently for a bus that could take him into town. He probably didn't have his own place now, but he had written to a good friend before he was released, asking him to stay with him for a few days until he could figure out a room and a job. Friend lived alone, and Henry didn't mind helping Andy. Sitting on a ramshackle bench, the ex-convict wondered how he had managed to get behind bars in the first place, and so quickly lost 5 years of his own, still young life. The boy had gone over the events of that day in his head probably more than 1,000 times, and he still hadn't found a coherent explanation. The only way he could justify his own stupidity at the time was his lack of the necessary life experience and his complete inexperience in dealing with people. This whole nightmare had happened exactly 5 years earlier. Andy had barely turned 20 at the time, but he was already hard at work on the local highway, driving people from the bus station to the nearby villages and hamlets. Of course, working as a private cab driver wore the guy out, but he was used to taking care of himself since childhood, and he simply could not sit idle. Andy had started to work in his own car not long before he mostly plowed 12 hours a day in warehouses as a loader and moonlighted as a handyman on a city construction site. This zeal of the young man was soon rewarded. Andy managed to raise enough money to buy an old used car from a neighbor. With his help, he gradually joined the community station bombs who did not mind to earn a penny honest work and help the ordinary citizens, the rates of official cab for which sometimes were unaffordable. In general, Andy's life had never indulged. Always and everywhere, he had to get his hard work. It so happened that the fate of the young cab driver from his childhood was firmly tied to poverty and loneliness. Little Andy's parents, for as long as he could remember, had always been drinking, and that had ruined them. When once again the two of them got drunk in the store where his mother worked as a clerk and his father as a longshoreman, one of them accidentally forgot to put out a cigarette. The fire in the back room where the boy's parents were indulging in alcoholic beverages broke out almost immediately, instantly spreading to the warehouse adjacent to the back room. Because of their half-asleep state of intoxication, the mother and father were unable to get out of the burning building in time and thus died. All this happened when Andy had just turned 7, the year he was supposed to go to first grade, but instead ended up straight in an orphanage. The child had no other relatives, and none of the boy's neighbors wanted to take in the son of an alcoholic. The next few years, the boy spent learning to protect his interests and feelings from the attacks of the more aggressive kids. Teenagers at first teased and bullied Andy all the time, coming up with hurtful nicknames, and each time reminding him that he grew up in a family of friend kids. Scum, alcoholic, vodka's son were just some of the nicknames the cruel kids used to hurt young Brown. However, the boy did not let himself be hurt, and often those who dared to say such things in front of him immediately paid with a broken nose or a big black eye. No matter how low his parents had fallen, Andy still loved them, and he was very sad when his mom and dad were gone. Partly because of the stress he'd been under, and partly because of the difficult life in the orphanage. But Andy had grown up a taciturn, somewhat moody young man used to working hard and not talking much. The boy believed that only those who had enough money to get a loaf of bread for tomorrow could afford to be lazy. As soon as the orphanage boy got his own room from the state and was released from the unfriendly orphanage, he was greatly relieved. No longer did he have to prove his worth to his teachers and educators, to fight for a free meter in a room that sometimes held up to 7 people at a time, and to dodge the daily taunts of his elders, who prophesied that his parents would end as sadly as he had. For the first time, after escaping from this stuffy captivity, the boy felt completely independent of the opinion of others. Now, he was free to dispose of his life as he saw fit, without regard to countless rules and restrictions, wasting no time. Andy immediately began looking for a job. He didn't know what awaited him tomorrow, but he tried to make every day as efficient as possible, earning as much as possible, more than yesterday, and hoping for a brighter future. After buying a used, older car, Andy felt as if he had reached a new level where he could control his income on his own. Now he could concentrate fully on earning as much as possible rather than working. For a day and a half for some mister who didn't even know that he would pay him as much as he had originally promised. Such cases also often happened in Andy's working life. Especially often, such things happened to the young man on construction sites where greedy foremen at times, getting out of hand, could take up to 70% of the original amount of the deal. That's why, after acquiring his own car, Andy felt truly happy for the first time in almost 10 years. On that fateful day, when the event in Andy's life that completely changed his whole destiny happened, he was, as usual, working as a taxi driver on his usual route. The winter had been particularly cold, and the newly repaired highway had been an ice rink, so the cab drivers were constantly exchanging information about the most dangerous stretches of road. That time was no exception. Brown had already made 3 trips, and now, after dropping off an elderly couple near a small cottage village, he was trying to get back to the station by slowly pulling onto the main highway. Contrary to the forecasts of the weather forecasters who promised a clear day, it suddenly snowed unexpectedly, and then a fierce snowstorm began. The highway, already particularly slippery that day, soon turned to glass. Andy, at that moment, said to himself all that he thought about the local utilities. At the same time, he tried to keep the steering wheel and the average speed on the highway. After a couple of minutes, in the rear-view mirror, the guy saw some kind of shadow. A few seconds later, the shadow quickly took on the shape of an expensive sports car, racing down the track at no less than 80 kilometers per hour. Andy didn't even know how it was possible at first. Because of the growing snowstorm, it was getting harder to see anything ahead. The car was racing down the highway, seemingly unconcerned that any wrong move of the steering wheel would instantly throw it into a ditch. There was a whitish gloom in front of the cars for miles ahead. Andy prudently switched on his headlights so he could see at least a minimal stretch of road in front of his car. Is he out of his mind? Andy shook his head. They drive recklessly around the track, and then they're surprised they're in trouble, and they get fines almost every week. He gingerly shifted the speed limit to minimum. The sports car in front, however, raced through the blizzard faster and faster and faster and faster, as if someone was chasing it. A moment later, he heard the shrill sound of squealing brakes and then a thud. The expensive car in front of him had hit some poor guy who had inadvertently decided to run across the icy road. The car spun around a few times and stopped carefully in front of the guardrail, miraculously avoiding hitting it. The young cab driver hit the brakes in shock and almost lost control himself. He had never expected such a turnaround. He jumped out of the car and quickly sprinted toward the sports car, swatting away the sticky flakes of snow that tumbled into his eyes and mouth as he went. His boots were slipping mercilessly on the ice, so he didn't make it to the crash site right away. First, he had to walk about 300 yards down the frozen highway as he went, and he tried to get his phone out of his jacket pocket to dial 911. Frost intensified, and it became much colder outside, and Andy immediately regretted not bringing a hat with him that day. The heater in his car was usually enough to keep him warm between trips. When he finally got to the car, he saw that the door on the driver's side of the car was wide open. Behind the wheel was a young girl, no older than Andy. She was shivering and crying. Her bright makeup was smeared all over her face, and her light blouse and short coat looked as if they were going somewhere in a clear hurry, and she didn't care what she wore. Brown slowly turned his gaze to the victim. He was a man, about 45 years old. Judging by the smell of liquor on his breath, Andy deduced that the poor guy had probably been drinking heavily before he went out. The man's winter coat, thrown loosely over his body, and his high boots, the laces of which were untied, also testified to this. The drunk man's fur hat was lying nearby. The man was moaning heavily, but he looked fine, at least not with any visible signs of blood or fractures, and he found maybe he was really hurt, or maybe he was just pretending, because they say that drunks can get out of any traumatic situations unharmed, right? Andy immediately thought of his parents and mentally faltered. Not everyone, he thought, and decided to call the paramedics just in case. They knocked me down, you bastards. They rolled me to death, moaned the injured man, though he was already able to sit up normally. Hold on, I'll get help, Andy said as he walked, trying to unlock his phone with numb fingers. Then, behind him, a low voice sounded, "Don't. Please don't." Andy turned around in surprise. The girl, the driver of the sports car, was looking at him with eyes full of pleading and tears and shook her head negatively. Girl, maybe you don't understand. You were in an accident. You hit a man. There he is, screaming, dear, almost turning inside out. We should call 911, the police. You must be in trouble, too. If you're crying so much, how are you feeling anyway? Andy tried to speak loudly and briefly so that the car owner could hear him through the howling blizzard. But she only continued to shake her head stubbornly, insisting. For a moment, the cab driver even glimpsed that she must be insane, her large, emerald green eyes glowing so brightly. No, I'm begging you. That's the thing. If my father finds out about this, he'll kill me himself. I'll do it now, but please don't call anyone. She started rummaging through her purse, tensely searching for something in the depths, while Andy froze in indecision, with her fingers still hovering over the speed dial button for emergency services. Here, take it, she whispered frantically on her lips, holding out her wallet to the guy. You can have all the money in there, just don't call anywhere. No, that won't do, Andy said, with his hands up in a defensive gesture. I don't want your money, but that poor man looks like he's about to freeze to death. So either let me call someone or call your father. The girl's hands fell helplessly to her knees. She shoved the wallet back into the bag and then pressed her palms to her weeping face. She was shaking with cold and nerves. Yes, now. God. The accident victim took a few deep breaths, and only then was she able to select the right contact in the notebook of her cell phone. You're all bastards. He and Andy were swearing in a slurred voice at the victim. A man's dying here and they're playing games. The man gave a couple of loud hiccups, then sank back onto his back. Andy tried to pick him up and drag him to the passenger seat of the sports car, but he started to kick desperately. I'll sue you all. Great, so you'll live, Andy said harshly, but still managed to get the indignant sufferer into the warm cabin. I don't want this bum to freeze anything, the cab driver grumbled grudgingly, shaking his hands of the snow. The girl driver, meanwhile, was calling her father. Andy couldn't hear the whole conversation, but he could clearly distinguish that the conversation between the relatives was clearly in elevated tones. The man was loudly indignant as he heard that his pretty daughter had been involved in a serious accident. That's it. He'll be here soon, the girl assured him. The cab driver nodded and walked to his car. He wanted to get warm, at least a little. He poured himself some hot tea from a thermos and glanced again at the unnaturally turned around on the track. From his seat, Andy could not see what the girl was doing at that moment, but he felt no sympathy for her. Because of such girls, a lot of people died on the roads every day, while the parents of these golden chicks easily pay off the justice and relatives of the dead or seriously injured later. Surely this time it will be just the same, the boy thought sadly. 20 minutes later, a huge black Mercedes business class arrived at the place, with wheel rims polished to a dazzling shine. A tall, stout man in his 50s with a neat short haircut and a mustache came out of the car. He wore an expensive black coat and a light-colored scarf that hung carelessly from his large neck, as if the man was always a little hot. With his small black eyes, he looked first at his daughter's car and then at the cab driver. The businessman knew right away. Andy recognized the girl's father as the famous banker, Steve James, the richest and most influential man in their town. The boy was a little surprised that he drove out in this weather, without the slightest protection, although by statute he was probably supposed to have a whole squad of bodyguards. However, very soon Andy guessed that in this way, Steve decided to protect himself from unnecessary attention and witnesses of the accident. He did not know until the end what he would see on the track. In the banker's mind, he immediately developed a cunning plan which he hoped could get him and his stubborn daughter out of the situation with minimal losses. Glancing with cold anger at the girl behind the wheel, but without the cab driver seeing it, James turned to the latter. Thank you, kid, for not calling the police. You stepped in, you might say, and took pity on your daughter. But I have a feeling we're not going to be able to just let this go. Excuse me. Confused, Andy asked again. The banker looked at him and sighed sadly, slowly twirling the massive ring on his index finger. It's just the press. They're like wolves. Throw them a bone of meat. They'll come for the whole carcass. And I'm not the last person in town. Don't be embarrassed. I can see that you recognize me. I can't even imagine what will happen to my reputation when those reporters get wind of it. Andy looked closely at the banker. Well, that's your problem. I'm sorry. What's that got to do with me? James glanced at his daughter, her eyes wide with amazement, already guessing what would follow her father's complaints. The businessman only smiled indulgently at the cab driver, as if he were an irrational child. What's your name? The banker asked. Andy. Andy Brown. Tell you what, Andy. The businessman patted the young man on the shoulder in a friendly manner while dragging him away from his daughter's sports car. I see you're a smart guy. You might even say a smart guy. You might even say a smart guy. Can we make a deal? Brown instantly dropped James' hand from his shoulder. What are you talking about? The businessman rolled his eyes. Andy, I didn't think you'd get it so hard. I offer you a good deal. You take over the daughter's hit, and I pay you a tidy sum for it. You see, I have so many contracts, so many people dealing with me in my bank. It would be a real nightmare if this whole story suddenly came out, and it would remember what I just told you about the reporters. Andy stood in front of the businessman in complete shock. What are you suggesting? Are you asking me to take the blame for your daughter? Here we go, James exclaimed cheerfully. Thank goodness, or I thought I was going to have to explain everything to you. Are you out of your mind? The cab driver was outraged. Do you realize that you are suggesting that I commit a crime? No, I did not sign up for that. The businessman put his arm around Andy again, but this time his embrace was more like a bulldog's grip. Oh, please, let's not be so dramatic. Well, look at him. The businessman nodded toward the hitman, who was already snoring in the passenger seat of his daughter's car. I guarantee you tomorrow morning this alcoholic won't even remember what happened to him, especially not who hit him. You have nothing to lose. You'll do 6 months of house arrest at most, and that's it. But for me, it's a disaster, you know. I won't hurt you for the money. These 6 months you'll live like a king, even though yesterday you were just a driver in a cab for a penny. Will 6 million do it for you? How much? A dumbfounded Andy asked again. 6 million rubles, the businessman grinned slyly. Come on, don't be a fool, agree to it. Where else could you make that kind of money? All you have to do is bend your bumper a little and that's it. No one will even bother to say that it was not you, but my daughter who hit the fool. All will even bother to say that it was not you. More. He's alive. It'll burn out, I'm telling you. Andy hesitated. On the one hand, he was not a fool, and was well aware that what James the banker was offering him now was not only immoral, but also illegal. But on the other hand, the former orphan really wanted money, because nothing had ever fallen from the sky on him in this life. And here, as if the money itself was floating into his hands. Besides James, a respected and influential man, why would he cheat on someone who could save his career and his daughter's reputation? With 6 million, Andy could not only buy himself a new car. With such a solid sum, the guy could try to open his own business. A car wash, for example, or take out a loan to add a little more to the money and open a shop. In general, he had options on how to use the millions to his advantage. Well, all right, the orphan agreed wistfully. If you don't cheat me, I'll help you. But are you sure I can get off with a suspended sentence? After all, it's not a school cone on the road. Of course I'm sure, Andy, the banker assured him fervently, and secretly rubbed his hands with pleasure. Look how successfully he was able to organize everything and close the matter. Now his daughter was saved, and he, in this sordid story, would not show up anywhere. I'm glad we were able to understand each other so well." Andy James said goodbye. "Remember, boy, you made the right choice." Before leaving the young cab driver and the drunken man in the middle of the snow-covered highway, the banker took another good look around. What he needed was to find seat-deep cameras or random onlookers nearby. After checking everything and making sure of his own safety, the businessman ordered his daughter to follow him, and as quickly as possible. "Let's go," he tossed to the weeping girl behind the wheel of the sports car. "We'll talk more at home." The banker's daughter looked Andy with sadness in her eyes. She knew very well that this kind young man would probably not get any money, but there was no point in her defying her father's will now. So the girl only harder pressed the gas pedal, moving farther and farther away from this unfortunate stretch of road with each passing second. Andy, on the other hand, remained standing in the middle of the highway, waiting for the police and paramedics to arrive so he could confess to them what he'd never done. Of course, it didn't turn out the way James told the young cab driver. The man hit by the banker's daughter turned out to be a distant relative of the mayor. In a wicked irony, all the victim did at the trial was tell the prosecutor how rough Andy had treated him when he allegedly discovered that he had hit the man in the road. About the girl and the sports car, the mayor's relative never even mentioned it. Brown often wondered how it was possible that this drunken alcoholic would turn out to be the mayor's great-nephew and so dashingly ruin his whole life. However, and the guy was well aware of it, he himself, with his own hands, signed his own sentence. The mayor's drunken relative was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. After all, there is a lousy sheep in every flock, even one as high up as this one. Brown got 5.5 years in prison for nothing, or rather, only for hitting a relative of an official. The press was happy to savor the details of the case, constantly debating whether those in power had the right to punish ordinary citizens so harshly, especially when they were hardly to blame for the accident, given the victim's alcoholic state. Steve James, on the other hand, preferred not to get involved. He didn't want to spoil his relationship with the mayor, nor did he want his name to appear in the case of some orphan. Like most rich and greedy people, James wished to come out of the whole affair with his reputation intact, and all his promises of easy probation for Andy and the millions that followed turned out to be nothing more than empty words. During the entire time the cab driver had been in jail, he had received only a few packages of food and warm clothes. And even then, those little colorful boxes were not from the great banker, but from some girl Andy didn't even know. I never heard from James again. He left the boy to survive on his own, in a place where most people broke like straws in a hurricane wind. The squeak of the bus tires on the gravel made Andy shudder. For a second he thought he was standing all alone again, in the middle of the snow-covered highway. He rushed to push the unpleasant memories away, got on the bus, and in a couple of hours he was back in his hometown. Just as Andy had planned, he was able to stop at his friend's taxi company. Jason took Brown's return from juvie calmly, especially since, before the accident on the highway, they had been quite friendly. Andy's own room had already been repossessed by the state, so he was immensely grateful to Jason for agreeing to let him stay with him for a while. In the evening, as the two men packed a simple dinner and opened a bottle of beer, Jason dared to ask his friend what he planned to do next. In response, the ex-prisoner only smiled enigmatically. "I need to collect a debt from a character." "Come on." Jason didn't believe me. "Do you still have any connections here?" "I thought you were going to start from scratch again." "You know I'll be there for you if you need me." And I thanked his friend and asked, "Listen, do we still have James Bank in our city? I think they used to have their headquarters downtown." Jason looked at his friend with some suspicion. "What do you want? You want to rob them, don't you?" He made a joke. But then he realized that the joke was ambiguous. "I'm sorry, friend. I didn't mean it like that." "It's okay, I understand," Andy said. "No, Jason, it's going to be fair. There's a banker who owes me money, and a lot of it. Time has passed, and the debt has not been repaid. It's time he has not been repaid. It's time he had his honor." Jason didn't ask his friend any more questions, realizing that the subject had more to do with Something personal than just a financial matter. After a little more talk on the distractions, the young men went to bed. For the first time in the last 5 years, Andy slept on a soft mattress, though an old cot, and not on a hard bunk. He thought this was a good sign, and life seemed to be getting better in its smallest details. Early the next morning, Andy went to the James Bank, owned by James himself. It was a tall, modern building, with at least 15 floors devoted entirely to the bank's infrastructure. The guy just whistled. Since his arrest, the building had been noticeably enlarged with huge mirrored panels and a bright, stylish design. You wouldn't even know from the outside that the owner of all this splendor was a ruthless scoundrel and a miser. The former cab driver was about to enter the room, but he was immediately stopped by a security guard at the entrance, who immediately recognized Andy as a recently released prisoner. He knew from the guard's tense face that he couldn't get in to see James easily. "What do you want?" The man in the black suit asked rudely, blocking the orphan's way. "I'll bet you don't have a deposit in our bank, and if you decide to take out a loan, I'll tell you right off the bat that you won't get any money. Sorry, we don't sponsor ex-convicts here." "I'd like to see James, Steve James," Andy said calmly. "Tell him I have an appointment. I'm sure he'd be happy to see me." The guard just laughed in the young man's face. "Really? Do you want to go see James? He's got an appointment, man. That's how all the homeless and convicts would have come here. Get out while you still got your hands and feet." "I don't like to tell you twice." But Andy wouldn't budge. He was determined to finish the job he started 5 years ago. "Well, if you don't call your boss right now and report me, you're going to be in big trouble tomorrow." And from the boss himself, "I wouldn't play around like that if I were you, man." Brown looked at the guard with his trademark hitman stare, which had often intimidated the guy's adversaries while he was in juvie. To his delight, the James Bank guard bought it. Lowering his eyes, the guard grudgingly muttered Andy's request into the radio. Former cabbie watched with pleasure as his nasty smirk slid off the suit-clad man's face. Finally, the security chief waited for an answer from James himself, and Andy, with evident apprehension and reluctance, was escorted to the 14th floor, the bank director's office. "We'll wait here at the door, Steve James," the guards warned the banker. "If anything, you know how to act in such cases." "Of course, William." James responded with icy calmness, and only then did the door close behind Andy, leaving him alone with the businessman. To Andy's enormous amazement, James acted as if the man before him had not spent 5 years in prison on a false charge that the banker had tricked him into taking on him. "Oh, it's you," he tossed the boy lazily. "Well, come on, tell me why you came." "I listened to you carefully, young man," the businessman added with a sneer in his voice, and he stared at his abuser in silence. For so many years, every night, he had imagined this moment, how he would stand before James and tell him everything that had accumulated over the years in his broken soul. He'd rehearsed the words on purpose, thought about what he would say to the villain first, but now all thoughts flew from his head like frightened birds, leaving only the bitterness of disappointment at what he'd seen. This was not how he had imagined explaining himself to the businessman. Finally, the ex-convict found the strength to speak. "You owe me, Steve James. You owe me a lot." James pretended to be surprised, his thick gray eyebrows slowly creeping upward. "Oh, I see. And I thought you came to me out of pure politeness, to ask me how I am, how my daughter is after that terrible accident. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about." Andy got mad. "You had me for 5 years in the penitentiary, and I could only see the sky through an iron cage, and you could have saved me. You could have helped me." The boy clenched his fists in despair. The banker noticed the gesture, and his hand slowly reached for the panic button, hidden under the table. "What could I do for you, kid?" Steve James tried to distract him from his actions. "You hit a man. We barely got him out of there. I had nothing to do with it." Brown took a couple of steps toward the businessman, raising his hand in a threatening manner. "How can you sit there and lie to my face like that, huh? You were there, along with your daughter, and you promised me 6 million if I would write it up for myself. Or have you already forgotten about it? James's lips stretched into an unpleasant smile, the way a shark smiles before it eats its prey. Ah, that was a good place to start, Andy. You're here for the money, you remembered. He's always talking about some bullshit, and it's all lies and conscience and honor. The banker rose smoothly from the table and, taking his wallet out of his pocket, counted out a couple of dozens of dollars with a lazy hand, and then, squeamishly, threw them under Andy's feet. Former cab driver was confused by the humiliation. He hadn't even expected it from a man as vile as James. Well, what about you, Andy? Don't be silly, take your money. Or did you think I was going to give you 6 million with interest? $500,000 for every year you did time. Is that it? The banker laughed maliciously, and at that moment it was as if a dam that had been held back for years had burst inside Andy. Now he was ready to do anything, and if necessary, even take revenge. That's not what we agreed to, Steve James. If you refuse to pay your debt, then I refuse my obligation to keep quiet about what really happened on the track. The banker's laughter broke off abruptly. The tall, dense man began aggressively stepping on the former detainee. "Who's going to believe you, puppy?" he hissed. There was no one else there but us and that alcoholic lunatic. And the camera's surprised they weren't there either. So you can't prove a damn thing, all right? Especially after all these years. James shoved Andy in the shoulder, and he swayed. For a man of his age, the businessman had a pretty powerful punch. "Anyway, I'll go to the reporters and tell them everything." Brown blurted it out in his heart. "They're like wolves, remember. They always come for the rest of the carcass. I'll throw them the firewood and then let them investigate themselves who and what was there." Steve James's face turned red, a grim grin distorting his face. "You wouldn't dare. I'm telling you, take your money and get out of here before you go to jail for a second time. Rest assured, I'll make sure they put you as a repeat offender in the darkest and stinking cell, from which you'll never, ever get out of." James shouted to the guards to get Andy out, and as much as the guy resisted, the two huge thugs did their job just fine. A few minutes later, he was swallowing street dust, lying face down on the pavement in front of the bank's front door. The orphan slowly got up and staggered away, cursing the world and his own stupidity. The boy felt something hot on his face. Gently touching his scratched cheek, Andy saw the transparent moisture on the pads of his fingers. They were tears, sincere and so cruel. However, no sooner had he walked a few dozen steps than someone gently grasped his elbow. "Wait," said a pleasant woman's voice behind him. "We need to talk. Please." Something in the tone of the request sounded familiar to Andy, and he turned around slowly. Well, of course he did. Eyes as green as the world's most beautiful emeralds. The banker's daughter stood before him. "I know it's probably too late to talk about this now, but I'm sorry if you can. I know your life has been completely ruined because of me." James's daughter stood in front of Andy, but how very different her appearance was from the way Brown himself remembered it. Instead of fancy shoes, simple worn sneakers, no couture dresses or jackets, just a plain, light-colored shirt and light blue jeans, belted with a wide leather belt. She put her beautiful ash-colored hair into a simple ponytail. The change in the girl pleasantly surprised the boy, but he was still full of resentment against her and against her greedy father. "What more do you and Daddy want from me?" Andy asked harshly, rubbing his cheek on the pavement. "You don't have to pretend you want to help me. You got me fooled, and now you're all set." "Bravo!" Andy clapped his hands theatrically in front of her face. "I don't even know your name, only that you are James, just like him." She pressed her lips together ashamedly, hesitated for a moment, and then said quickly, "I'm not James. I'm Austin. Melissa Austin. I was the one who sent you the packages when you were, well, when you were in jail." Andy stared at her in utter amazement. "I know it might look weird, but please, just hear me out. Maybe then you'll understand. Melissa Austin, Andy repeated the girl's name thoughtfully. "I've heard that name somewhere before." The banker's daughter nodded. "Please, let's go to that cafe over there and have coffee, and I'll tell you everything." "I have no reason to lie to you. You saved my life." After thinking about it, the former cab driver agreed. He really had nothing more to lose, and therefore he could sit in a cafe. "It's okay, he won't fall apart. Listen to the girl who sent him the brightly colored boxes." "And then we'll see," Andy thought to himself. "Maybe I'll learn something valuable for myself." The young people went to a cafe, where they sat down at an empty table, and Melissa, taking her time, began to tell them about her life. The original name of the James Bank was Austin, after Melissa's parents, Christopher and Kate Austin. At that time, and it was many years ago, their family bank was not yet such a large-scale corporation and was considered more local, working mainly with regional partners, not affecting the capital. At the same time, Christopher Austin and his wife still had a lot of influence in certain circles. Then the company's policy was based solely on sustainable moral principles of its owners, such as honesty, generosity, and helping those in need. No person in a difficult life situation ever left Austin Bank empty. Empty-handed, they trusted their clients, went to the heart of their problems, and treated people with utmost respect. And clients, seeing such a good attitude to them, in return tried to use the money received on credit with maximum benefit for themselves, and therefore they almost never had serious debts to the bank. This was the main peculiarity of the company that distinguished Austin Bank from other similar commercial organizations. The first years of her life, Melissa grew up in an endless fairy tale. The girl was surrounded by wealth and luxury, and every summer she spent with her beloved parents, basking in the bright sun at the best European resorts. Parents of the rich heiress madly loved their daughter, so that she did not know the lack of anything. The most beautiful clothes, the most popular and best toys, which her classmates could only envy, all this Melissa had in abundance. Not every one of her peers could boast of having a personal driver in the family, who drove and brought the girl from classes from school and additional creative sections, and Melissa Austin had one. So was a kind, understanding nanny who often looked after the little girl while her parents were at work solving complex issues of their business. With such an abundance and variety of entertainment, Christopher and Kate Austin still did not forget the most important thing, the education of their beloved daughter. Parents had prepared a great future for Melissa, and in order for the girl to gradually approach it year after year on her personal separate account, the businessman had conserved quite a large sum. Melissa could unfreeze the account only when her time came for higher education. Her parents dreamed that their girl would study at a prestigious university in the country, receiving a truly international diploma. This was another point, thanks to which young Austin was not worried about her own future. The girl knew that everything in her life had already been taken care of by her wonderful parents, and therefore life in general seemed to Melissa measured and unconcerned. Perhaps this was her impression because she did not know that it could be any other way. This is how Melissa lived until she was 10, when tragedy suddenly came to her home. Her father, Christopher, died in a plane crash on his own private plane, along with his bodyguard and pilot. It happened when the head of the family was making an urgent and extremely important flight on the affairs of the company in one of the remote branches of the company, located in the far north. Melissa's heart shattered into 100 pieces, like a small porcelain statuette that had accidentally fallen from the dresser on the hard marble floor. For the first time since her birth, the girl felt as if a thin veil of gas had fallen from her eyes, exposing all the unsightliness and harshness of real life beneath. Melissa's mother had suffered a great deal in the first year after her husband's death, and then she began to let go. And then she found that she was unable to manage all the affairs of their family company alone. After a couple of years of suffering, Kate Austin decided to marry their father's former companion, whom Christopher Austin had deliberately abandoned several years ago. However, he was the only man who thoroughly understood all the processes of the bank from inside, and therefore the marriage with the cunning and crafty James was a kind of safety net for Kate. in case her knowledge was not enough to pass the business to her own daughter in the future. Steve James, however, had very different plans for the Austin bank account. Using flattery and deceit, he got his hands on all the assets of the company and, in fact, closed all the financial processes in the bank to himself. At the same time, James perfectly understood that, since he could no longer have children by virtue of his age, he had to take care in advance that Melissa's inheritance would not float away from him into the wrong hands of a possible future son, in-law, or even worse, the girl herself. To this end, the cunning banker immediately adopted the girl, becoming her foster father, and with this prematurely unfroze her study bank account and transferred all the money to overseas accounts in an offshore, breaking them into small cash batches. Now, in case of an emergency, he would always have a separate financial cushion to help him get through a crisis period of up to 5 or 6 years without a problem. Kate Austin, seeing how the new husband was consistently destroying Melissa's father's company and step by step destroying all the principles on which he and Christopher had based their business for many years, was terribly angry and wanted to file for divorce without James' right to claim any shares in the company or other monetary assets. But unfortunately, it was too late. The final blow that finally undermined. The girl's mother was the nullification of all shares of Austin Bank and its subsequent rebirth into James Bank with completely new, oppressive principles of customer service. Completely depressed by the fate of her family and her life's work, Kate Austin suffered a severe nervous breakdown, as a result of which she had to go abroad for long-term treatment. From there, she never returned, explaining in a letter to her daughter as the reason for her action the inability to continue to exist in the world in which her once ideal family and professional life had become. The girl was greatly offended by her mother at that moment, and, to tell the truth, she could never fully forgive her, though she understood the reasons for her behavior. Melissa was left in the full power of her stepfather, alone with his teenage problems and a cruel, cunning man ready to do anything just to stay forever at the helm of the obtained by such a false and dishonest way. The Austins' banking empire. The girl had to endure a lot of humiliation and abuse from her foster father. All of them were related to her current status as an orphan, doing, in James' opinion, absolutely nothing useful that could be somehow used for the development of his company. When Melissa grew up and turned into an attractive young girl, Steve James planned to make a cunning move and marry his stepdaughter to the son of his longtime financial partner, who lived and conducted his main business in the Arab Emirates. Melissa, learning that she was destined to become the third wife of a young Eastern businessman, was, of course, horrified. She was not going to cripple her life and even go to a completely unfamiliar and alien to her country just to expand the commercial interests of her stepfather. Then, Steve James threatened the girl that he would deprive her of what little was left in her bank account as expenses for women's things. However, this was of little concern to the rebellious girl. "You can have it all for yourself. I won't even think of marrying your sheik. What more can you do to me? Well, what? Are you going to take me to a brothel? You drove my mother to the point where she ran away from home, and now you want to get rid of me too by selling me to the highest bidder. I will never, you hear me, never trade my freedom for your trinkets." James looked pale, as if he'd been robbed of his most valuable prize, the prize he'd won by hard work in a fair contest. "Melissa, don't be such a fool. I care about you. You'll be a piece of cake with a husband like Acis. Any girl in your place would be on fire by now. You're the only one who's still playing hard to get, and you're not even 16. So, you'll go to the pubs for 5 more years. So what? All your beauty will be gone like gilding on a spoon, and you'll be left with nothing but tin. I'm offering you a real chance, girl. Respect your father. Stop playing games. Besides, I've already promised Zane he will send his matchmakers here one of these days. We will get acquainted." Melissa, realizing that she was condemned to be a bargain and a good deal, could not stand the persistent pressure of her stepfather, and that same evening tried to run away from home by stealing her parents' sports car. Unfortunately, a real storm was brewing on the road that day, and the girl did not notice how the drunken man drove under the wheels of her car. It all happened by accident, without any malice on Melissa's part. The story of the hit and run with the mayor's relative and the subsequent trial of the fellow cab driver changed the girl's life forever. All the bright feelings that her own father had espoused for so many years rose up inside her. Mercy, empathy, the desire to help her fellow man in a difficult situation. Melissa decided to continue, at least in a small part of her work, all that her father had done when he was director of the Austin Bank. The girl willingly joined the ranks of the volunteer organization while permanently leaving her parents' mansion, where her hated stepfather is now at ease. Heir to her parents, Melissa began, along with like-minded people, to help the homeless and the sick, took a job in a charity kitchen, and now, every Thursday, feeds those who cannot feed themselves or find a job. With James Austin Jr., cut off all relations. She did not answer his calls, and then changed her number altogether so that his guards could not reach her. For the next 5 years, Melissa lived in the dorm with the other volunteer girls. She learned to appreciate the pleasures of life and never forgot for a moment the young cab driver serving time in juvie in her place, so she felt it was her duty to do something for Andy, even if it was a package in a funny box consisting of groceries and necessities. With this simple action, Melissa tried to ease her own conscience and support her savior. As she finished her story, Melissa fell into an embarrassed silence. Andy was quite surprised, but still didn't understand what the girl wanted from him. Yeah. Well, what do you expect me to do? For me to forgive you, I was never really mad at you. It was just your stepdad, James. He was the one who ruined my life, not you. Melissa exhaled convulsively. She was grateful for the guy's understanding and for at least taking the time to listen to her. Well, here's what I'd like to offer you. Come join us, the volunteer organization. I should warn you right away, we do not have any special facilities. All participants are equal among themselves. But what I can definitely guarantee you is a bowl of hot soup and a dry and clean bed where you won't be bitten by bedbugs. The girl smiled softly at the edge of her lips. She hoped very much that Andy would accept her offer. The boy, however, still doubted whether he should trust the one who had caused so much trouble in his life. He didn't blame her anymore, but still, thank you. I'll think about it. The former cab driver cautiously answered her. Back to his friend Jason, Andy told him everything that had happened to him. The friend was very surprised and outraged by the banker's actions, but advised Andy to think about Melissa's offer. Still, for the first time, it might be a way out for you, he explained to his buddy. At least until you find something better. Eventually, Andy agreed to volunteer and began helping Melissa. The charity work distracted the guy from his dark thoughts and memories from the past, and besides, he always liked helping people. Gradually, the stony soul of the orphanage boy thawed, and quietly for himself he fell in love with his partner. Melissa's feelings turned out to be mutual, so after a while the young people got married, but continued to work as volunteers. A year later, Melissa got the wonderful news that she and Andy would soon become parents. The guy was very happy to hear, but he was going to have a baby boy or a little girl. He surrounded his spouse with tenderness and care in every way, and did not let her overwork. The guy, after all the trials and hardships, really wanted to have a normal, healthy family. Meanwhile, Steve James was met with a severe punishment for his sins. Left all alone, without his wife and adopted daughter, the man finally realized how empty his life had been without family and kinship. Unfortunately, to restore all this, it was too late. James developed a severe form of cancer. The doctors only throw up their hands. The treatment could not save him. The banker had only a few months to live. At the moment when he was diagnosed, Steve James for the first time wondered what he was going to do with his fortune. He couldn't take it with him to the other world, could he? After locating, with the help of his assistants, his adopted daughter and her cab driver husband, Steve James summoned them to his house and sincerely apologized to the couple. "Forgive me, children, old fool. Money has blinded me completely. I've caused you so much grief, but I hope that at least this can fix something." With fading hands, the banker held out some paper to Melissa. After reading it, the girl realized with amazement that in front of her was a deed of gift, in which James leaves him and Andy all his possessions, the right to accounts, and most importantly, gives his adopted daughter her bank. "This company rightfully belongs to you." By right of blood, gasping in pain, the ailing businessman uttered, "I'm sure you can return everything to the way it was before I ruined it. Forgive me, daughter. Forgive me." Tears of sincere remorse glistened in Steve James' eyes. A stunned Melissa and her husband, of course, forgave their dying stepfather. The couple moved into Melissa's parents' mansion to be able to fully care for James in his allotted time. Alas, karma caught up with the banker exactly 1 month later. He passed away in his sleep. Melissa sold the Austins' mansion and put some of her stepfather's company stock in the hands of her father's trustworthy partners, whom her mother recommended to her. Kate Austen was still living abroad, but she and her daughter managed to find common ground and make up. The girl's mother promised that she and her husband would come to her for the christening of their future child. Brown, Austen family took a part of money from offshore accounts to build their own family nest, and they invested another part of the money to build a large charity foundation with an adjacent center for people in need. Now Melissa and Andy are waiting for their firstborn to be born, and they enjoy every day they spend together. They are perfectly happy, and they truly believe they will continue to be so.